Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Out of Nowhere. On tonight's show, our special guest today is David Bryant. We're going to talk about did we go to the moon or not? We're going to talk about UFOs, maybe touch on a bit about ghosts later on in the show, and different other things as well. So keep watching and learning tonight. Can we please welcome David to the show? Hello there.
Hello, Bob. Hello, everybody. Nice to be here.
Yes, thank you very much for coming. David, for the listeners who may not know your work, what first drew you to the subject of UFOs and the moon?
Well, it's a story that goes back 70 years, Bob. I grew up just outside London, and I was what's called a latchdoor kid, you know. So my mum and dad both worked. So my mum used to drop me off at school half an hour early, and I used to sit in the playground, and just wait for somebody else to turn up. Well, one morning I was sitting there, and I'll tell you exactly when it was. It was in 1957, and I looked up, astonished. There's this silver disc about the size of appeared to be what I would now say the size of a 747. It was travelling from west to east across the sky, and it was reflecting the sun's rays from below the horizon. So it was pretty high, and it
Yeah.
was trailing kind of smoke and flames. I was just totally intrigued by it. And later that morning, when the headmistress came in, she used to drag me into her office to keep me out of harm's way and give me a glass of milk. I told her all about it, and she said, "Oh, it must be a comet, boy. There are two comets. There's Aaron Rowland and Marcos. You must have seen one of them." I know what I saw, and ever since then, I was a precocious little brat. I started buying and borrowing books about UFOs. I've still got most of them, Frank Scully and all those people, and I've been interested ever since. And my wife and I both did astronomy. Part of our degrees were astronomy, and so it's a natural thing to be looking up. And I've always been interested in the subject. Um, so that's how it was. And lucky enough, later on, as you probably know, to start a business where I sold flown
Me too.
memorabilia from spacecraft.
Oh, yeah.
Through doing
Yeah.
that, I used to sell them at these big astronaut encounters. Through that, I got to be quite friendly with well over 30 astronauts and cosmonauts. Among them were seven of the Apollo astronauts. And I was very lucky enough to have a few beer calls with those guys. And while they won't say much, well, they won't say anything now, most of them are dead, but they wouldn't say much in public about UFOs, but they did speak in private about them. And they're just as intrigued as we are in many ways. So it's a whole thing. It's a whole life experience for me, right the way through from the 50s, right way through. I mean, I used to, communicate, chat with um, Jesse Marcel Jr.,
Oh, yeah, Jesse. Yeah, yeah.
his son Jesse Jr. Unfortunately, he's passed as well now. And and I spent a lot of
Yes.
time chatting with Edgar Mitchell too, the Apollo astronaut. He has some. He was born in Roswell, believe it or not, and he was a good friend of Jesse Jr. So all that kind of goes together to sort of make the whole thing real to me.
Oh, I can imagine so. What convinced you this was a subject worth researching seriously enough to write Our Forbidden Moon?
Um, well, I should say first, or two things I want to say first of all about that. The first is that I used to, for years, I gave lectures to astronomy groups and schools and so on about the Apollo program, of which I was a big fan. I've kept a spaceflight journal since 1961 when Gagarin went up, and always
Oh,
through.
my
I was
God,
a
yeah.
massive fan of the Mercury program and Gemini, and I knew all the astronauts' names. I still do. And so, of course, when I got to meet them, it was wonderful, intriguing. And the first thing I will say is they are the Apollo astronauts, all the American astronauts, they are incredibly patriotic, incredibly, very nice people, most of them, apart from one, I shan't say who. Um, but I would sit down with them and have beer call, we'd have breakfast together. I used to have drinks with them. I tell you what, for athletic types, they can half drink.
I
Uh,
bet they can as
oh,
well.
I, I, a classic one is Jim McDivitt. Uh, I've never known anybody drink martinis the way he does or did. And Charlie Duke, considering Charlie Duke is supposed to be a recovered alcoholic, or recovered, he does love a Tanqueray martini. I've seen he drink me under the table, but when you talk to them and I suddenly over the years of spending time with them, I think they quite often they one guy will say one thing and one of the others will say something completely different, and you think, well, they can't both be telling the truth. Do you want a couple of examples?
Yes, please. Yeah.
Yeah, well, one day I was sitting at a dinner table with Alan Bean, who was the Apollo 12 moonwalker, and Gene Cernan, who was the Apollo 17 commander. And Cernan was chatting to my wife, and I was chatting to Bean, and I said to him, you've done some wonderful paintings, and you've had books published about your art, but you've never really explained what the whole thing felt like. The emotions behind it must have been incredible. He said, "Oh yeah, it was." I said, what about the descent phase of the Apollo mission? That must have been really, quite worrying, nerve wracking. And he sort of looked at us, no, you're in a vacuum, David. You just kind of drift down. I said, with all due respect, I mean, we've got a
Right.
10,000 pound thrust descent stage motor, just the other side of some cooking foil under your feet. The noise must be deafening.
Right, must be.
Yeah, he said, no, you're in a vacuum. You can't hear anything. I said, look, when I was in the Navy, I was lucky enough to have a few rides in Hawker Hunters. If you weren't wearing ear protectors, bone domes, it's the racket is and he got quite angry. Who's been to the moon, you or me? I said, okay, I guess you
Mm.
have. He said, you can't hear anything. Okay. And a bit later on, I asked Gene Cernan the same question, and he said, you're just about hanging on. He said, it's terrifying. If you weren't a trained, experienced pilot, you couldn't cope. He said, it's like sitting in an oil drum with people beating the outside with hammers. Can't both be right, can they?
No, they can't. No.
And then I remember one time I was chatting to Charlie Duke. As an astronomer, I was very keen to hear what the stars were like on the moon. And famously, as Neil Armstrong also said at various press conferences, he said, you can't see stars on the moon and you can't see stars in cislunar space, which is in between the Earth and the moon.
Yeah.
And I said, oh, that's really strange because Ed Mitchell, he said that you can see stars down to magnitude 5 or 6, certainly. And he looked at me and I said, does he say that? I said, yeah. He said, he's full of it, is Edgar. I thought, that's nice, And
Strange, you know. It
I
is
mean,
strange that each person says something totally different.
yeah. I said to him, look, I can stand on my driveway outside in front of my house with street lights on, the neighbours' lights on, with our security lights. And because I live in a really dark sky area of Norfolk, I can look up, even with all that, and I can see stars down to, magnitude 4. I can see the Milky Way, I can see the M31 galaxy, with all that, so I began to think that doesn't make any sense. And when I found out that I was, it just all sounds like hideous name dropping. I don't mean it to sound that way, but I mean,
No, it's all right.
yeah. I mean, I was talking to Jim Lovell about that, and I said, "What was the worst bit about the journey back on Apollo 13?" He said, "Well, the worst bit was we used to use star sights, get a star sight to navigate to make mid-course and corrections." And of course, we couldn't see stars because of all the junk from the exploding oxygen cells, floating around the command module. We just couldn't see anything. So in the end, we had to use the limb of the Earth as our dead point. I said, okay, so you could see stars normally. So oh, yeah, you can see stars. So he says that. Neil Armstrong says, I don't recall ever seeing stars on the moon or in cislunar space. I remember seeing he was on Sky at Night being interviewed by Patrick Moore. He said that on there. So I think why are they saying the opposite, contradicting each other all the time? I could go on and on and on, Bob, for hours giving examples of where one says one says the other. And
Yeah, I know.
so that's how I started doing the research, and I downloaded all the images from the the NASA catalogue of the Apollo missions, and I started recording the things the guys said to me, and that's in the end how I wrote that Our Forbidden Moon book.
It's a million. How many astronauts, in your view, actually set foot on the moon?
That's a good question. I could concede that. You see, the thing is, I'm absolutely. There's very good reasons for not thinking Apollo 11 happened. Apollo 12, so many daft and strange things happened on the Apollo 12 missions, and Apollo 13, say if the thing looks too good to be true, it probably is. Apollo 14 had a couple of really odd things. I don't. I'll just quickly tell you this. You know, Alan Shepard was the first American to fly in space. Okay,
Yeah,
in a little Mercury capture. It was a suborbital ballistic hop on a Redstone rocket. Very good, but they were just competing with the Russians in principle, not in actuality. The Russians already put somebody in orbit. So that was Alan Shepard's only space flight. Okay, he was shortly after the Apollo missions, when they were the Mercury missions, when they were selecting crews for the next phase, which was Germany. Well, naturally, the original Mercury astronauts were high up on the list on the roster. But Shepard had developed, I think it was Meniere's disease, a condition that affected his balance and various other aspects of his flight readiness. So he was grounded, as was Deke Slayton, who became head of the astronaut office.
yeah,
Well, one day, allegedly, Shepard goes up to Slayton at a cocktail party and he says, I've met a doctor who says that he can rectify my problems with Meniere's disease so I can get flight ready again. Now, this was after Germany. This was when they were selecting crews for the Apollo missions. Now, against all the expectations, he'd done none. The whole point about Germany, it taught them all the skills they needed for the Apollo missions to be successful. They had to.
right.
It was navigation. It was doing EVAs. It was leaving the capsule on a tether. It was the most important thing was how to rendezvous with a spacecraft in orbit, which they all had to learn to do, and it's not as easy as you might think. So Shepard had done none of that, and yet he's selected as the mission commander of Apollo 14, which is bizarre. Not the least because his crew member, his other moonwalker, was Edgar Mitchell, who'd never been in space at all.
Yeah, strange, isn't it?
Yeah, so they've had that failure with Apollo 13. So they've had 11 and 12, failure on 13, and yet the next mission, the high focus, that really has to go well. They pick a complete rookie and an astronaut who was grounded for medical reasons until months before selection. It just doesn't make any sort of sense.
It didn't, does it?
So then you think, okay, 14, and then you've got this famous thing of them messing about on the moon, particularly Shepard, and Mitchell was attempting telepathic communications with other entities while he was on the moon. I don't think we generally know that. And then you got Apollo 15. Well, that was a strange thing as well. I could go on. I think it's possible that 15, 16, and 17 might have gone to the moon. But I mean, I'll tell you, the issue is this: that Kennedy's famous speech in 1961, where he pledged that America would put a man on the moon and
Correct.
back safely by the end of the decade, and they rushed it. It was, it was so important, and of course, you know what happens in Apollo 1, the first mission, first manned mission. It caught the capsule caught fire on the
Mm,
pad, killing the three astronauts. Grissom, White, and Chaffee, which was a devastating because particularly Gus Grissom, he was the if you like, he was the pin-up boy of the Mercury missions,
yeah.
and he was the first American. He was the first astronaut to command a Gemini two-man mission too. So he was a real, high flyer. And he got killed. And his family have always said, believe it or not, that they feel he was murdered. They think it was the fire was. But whichever way you look at it, what then happened? They had to redesign the entire electronic bus on the thing. They had to redesign the hatch. completely, so it could be opened from the inside more quickly.
Yeah.
So, they had to invent or produce non-flammable fibres. They designed something called beta cloth. Now, why they didn't do this before, I don't know, but
Yeah.
so it goes. So it goes. All the electrical insulation had to be non-flammable. You're supposed to believe it only took them like 18 months to do all that.
Oh
Before,
God.
it doesn't make
No
sense, does it?
way.
Before Apollo 11, I just don't think Apollo 11 would have been ready, or 12.
No.
13, I think was. There's so much about that that's just doesn't ring true. So if somebody was to force me to concede that isn't it possible that some of the missions might have happened, I'd look at perhaps 16, 17. But even then, there's so much about both those, particularly 17. There's so much about it that's peculiar. But so it's a combination of all those things. So instead of the 12 men that are supposed to have walked on the moon, I concede it's possible. Though, you know what people always say? They say, "What about all the rocks they brought back?" Well, there's only three. They only found three minerals on the moon that were unknown on Earth. Okay, uh,
Right.
pyroxyferroite, tranquilityite, and almalcolite, and they were really proud of these things because they're not known as terrestrial minerals. They've all been found in in
Yeah.
reasonable abundance on Earth now. So in other words, nothing they brought back from the moon was unique. And secondly, I used to be a meteorite dealer. I used to lecture uh, about meteorites and sell them. You got to make a living, even if you're.
As you have.
And so I travelled all over Britain selling meteorites and so on and so forth. And one of the things I was best known for was selling lunar meteorites. Now I don't know how many of the listeners are aware that it's possible to obtain or to own or possess meteorites that have originated on the Moon, Mars, a vast number of asteroids, probably if not even Mercury, but certainly from the Moon. There are hundreds and hundreds. There are more kilos of lunar meteorites by a long way than there are lunar rocks from the Apollo missions in the Lunar Receiving Lab. So if you wanted to send somebody a sample of the moon, say this is a
Yeah.
sample of the moon, all you've got to do is give them a bit of a lunar meteorite because chemically it's got all the same
The
characteristics
same.
as a lunar rock because it's just been blasted off the moon's surface a few million years ago, perhaps. So it's got exactly the same physical and chemical characteristics.
Right.
And the killer is, again, something Jim Lovell told me I wasn't aware of. Several of the Apollo astronauts, or several American astronauts, actually went on meteorite collecting trips to Antarctica and found lunar meteorites. Um, so there's all kinds of these strange little connections and anomalies. You think, oh, So when people say about the moon rocks, I just don't buy that. And the other thing is, why have they still got so many hundreds of fragments of the lunar rocks in the lunar receiving lab?
Oh God, yes.
Why haven't they done anything with them yet? And as
Yeah,
you know,
exactly.
it's crazy. It's crazy.
Bonkers,
It's
isn't
still,
it?
it's still,
Um,
sorry, yeah.
what do you make of the claim that some of the lunar surface photographs appear to have been staged, altered, or otherwise?
But again, I once a guy I did used to enjoy. I mean, only by email and stuff. Was a
Yeah.
guy called Dr. Brian O'Leary, and he would have been um, a geologist or scientist astronaut aboard probably Apollo 18 or 19. I don't know if the listeners know this, but there were supposed to be three more missions, but they were all cancelled. And there's all kinds of reasons to give that. There were no more obvious targets and blah blah blah. It doesn't make any sense at all if you think about it, because the Saturn rockets already existed, the Apollo hardware already existed, so much so that instead of going to the moon on them, they use them for the Skylab missions and use them for the Apollo Soyuz joint mission. But this Brian O'Leary would have been on Apollo 18, I think, or Apollo 19. Anyway, I once asked him just that question you just said about the photos, and he said, I've just put a point to you." He said, um, "The Apollo astronauts spent 4,834 minutes in EVA, extravehicular activity, the
Yeah.
outside the capsule. And in that time, they took 5,771. So I've just been interfered with by my cat. 5,771 photographs.
Yeah.
Um, if you work that out, it means they're supposed to have taken a photograph every 50 seconds.
God, God.
And those 5,000 photographs were you could access them on the NASA website. You could download them. I did that one time. Um, Now, one photo every 50 seconds. Let's think about this. They had to sleep, they had to eat, they had to go to the toilet, they had to get in and out of their EVA suits,
Totally
they
impossible.
had to drive their buggies around, they had to do the experiments. They weren't just stood on the moon photographing every 50 seconds, were they? So you work out it doesn't make any sense at all. So
Mm.
I then said to him, do you think some of those photos were taken on Earth? And he said, again, I told him they're all very patriotic. And I suppose they also have to be very careful what they said, didn't they? And he said,
Yeah.
I'll tell you this, if the photographic material from the moon was not of adequate quality, um, or was not clear enough, I'm sure they would have produced suitable material on Earth. In other words, he more or less admitted they were faking them. You know, I could talk more on this if you want, but that in itself, I mean, I once spoke to a guy from Hasselblad. When I was writing this book, I did a lot of research. I didn't just make it all up as I went along.
No.
And if it's in the book, it's at the time as. I'll tell you one thing. It's really strange. Occasionally, I get asked to talk on the subject. Thank you very much for asking me on today. And I once did. Yeah, exactly right. Somebody's the jolly man. You're quite right. This guy from Hasselblad said, what happens if you put your camera with your film stock through the X-ray machines at the airport? And I said, no. He said, you take them out first because if you put it through in the X-ray, it would just blank them out, expose them all.
Yeah.
He said we had the cassettes inside the camera were plastic. He said the camera body was only thin aluminium. And he said, I've never really understood how they could walk about on the moon and the film not be fogged by solar radiation or cosmic radiation. He
Yeah.
didn't buy that at all. And he said, the thing that really worries me is how well, this is the Hasselblad guy. He said the photograph, some of the photography is unbelievable. It's beautifully framed. The astronauts are centered in it. Um, uh, there's the lighting is perfect, the exposure is perfect. He said that thing had a very limited facility to change any of the settings. He said in any case, their gloves were so thick and inflexible. I mean, I don't know if you ever read this quote, but um, Harrison Schmitt on Apollo 17 said that the gloves were so inflexible that every time he tried to close his hands to bend a rock, it pulled his fingernails off.
Oh my God.
Yeah, and he said that he and Cernan, they all their fingernails had been pulled off the fingernail beds, the finger beds, and were bleeding and were dusted and crusted, which is pretty funny because if you look at the photograph from on board the aircraft carrier after they've been recovered, they're cutting a cake and their hands look beautifully manicured.
They did.
I mean, the devil is in the detail, Bob. If you look into
Of
it enough,
course he is. If you look hard enough. And
and I,
there's another
you know,
question here. Yeah,
not
Francis Ford Coppola said that photographs are staged in eluded landings in Nevada. Do you think that's true then?
I'm not sure Francis Ford Coppola, but I'll tell you who did. Oh God, I'm getting old. My memories. Who's the guy who did The Shining and 2001 and all that?
Oh my God. Can't think.
Anyway, I think it'll come to me in 2 seconds.
Yeah.
But anyway, it's in Bedfordshire, a place called Cardington. There are two huge aircraft
Nice.
hangars, and they were built to house the airships, the R100 and the R101. They're really vast. And the guy, oh God,
Stanley Kubrick.
that's it. Kubrick is on record as saying that he was involved, more than involved. He actually admit before he died that he actually was in charge of making the videos, the films of the moon landings. Now, years ago, I was doing a talk at a famous public school near those hangars, and the science technician of the school came up to me and said, "Oh, it was a fascinating talk, Mr. Bryant." He said, "Thank you, Leslie Carver, Stanley Kubrick, absolutely." He said that I actually met the Apollo astronauts. I said, "Where did you meet those?" He goes, "Oh, at Cardington. I was there as a technician." I said, "Really? What were they doing?" He said, "Oh, they built a sound stage of the lunar surface. It was incredible. And they had a lunar module, and and Armstrong and Aldrin, and even had Collins was there, and they're taking photos and video of him, us, doing EVAs from the command module. Really?"
Yeah.
And I said, he said, "Have you got any photos? There's no record of this in the historical record." He said, "Oh, yeah, I've got pictures." Now, this is going to sound like a terrible conspiracy theory, and you've only got my word for it, but I promise you it's true.
Yeah.
Next time I went back to do a talk at the school, I said, "What happened to the technician?" "Oh, he was in a tragic car accident not long after your talk."
No.
Yeah, that's what I was told, um, which was, which is a bit of a shame. But I've had the use of Cardington corroborated by other people as well. But it's, I mean, people was. I got asked to do a talk on a prime time, early breakfast time TV, right, to
Yeah.
talk about the moon landings. And I asked them what they're going to ask me, what their angle was going to be, and I don't want to be held up for ridicule. At the time, I still do. I do, still do serious lectures, on conservation, wildlife, and on astronomy, meteoritics, astronautics, and stuff. And I said I'm not going to be held up for ridicule. If I say anything, it'll be generally speaking, it'll be stuff I can prove or can, um,
Correct.
yeah. So I said okay, and then they proceeded to trot out all this nonsense about would you this and how would this, and in the end, I said none of those questions actually are encouraging me to give the proper, like, the classic one. Why is there no crater under the Apollo lunar module in any of the photographs? And because I didn't do the show, they asked a famous female astronomer to do the show instead.
Oh my God.
And they asked her that question, and she said, "Oh yes, because because this that." And she said, "Anyway, don't forget they turned off the motor and drifted down to the surface." And I was seething. I said, "No, I was shouting at the TV. I said, "No, they didn't. They shuttled, but they shut they 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 throttled back to 60%. So there's still 6,000 pounds of thrust. I
Yeah.
mean, the moon is there's people have got a stupid idea. There's no gravity on the moon. There is. It's just a sixth of the Earth's gravity, and gravity, like our gravity, is an acceleration. So
Mm.
if you jumped off a 100-foot cliff on the moon, you'd still smash yourself to pulp when you hit the bottom because you'd be accelerating. You'd be accelerating at, I don't know, 2 meters per second, but you're still accelerating.
Right.
So that they land. What's the first thing that Buzz Aldrin said when the spacecraft landed? He said, "Contact light, okay, engine stop." Meaning,
Yes, it
yeah,
did.
they didn't stop the engine until the thing landed. It had these. If you think you've got the pads at the end of each of the four legs,
Yeah.
and below two of those is a long pole. That's the contact pole. When they hit the ground, it signaled to shut the motor. So it was all the questions they were asking were irrelevant. Would have had nothing to do with presenting the proper evidence in And I said, "How long will I get?" And he said, "3 minutes." That's not enough.
3 minutes.
Yeah, you and I could sit and talk here. I mean, it would have been nice to meet Holly Willoughby, obviously, but
Yeah.
3 minutes isn't long enough. You and I can sit and talk here. We're not going to, but we could sit and talk here for 10 hours. We still wouldn't cover everything.
No, we wouldn't know.
But that's
I
the
know
trouble.
Leslie Carver was saying photographs will be very difficult because of the differences in temperature on the moon.
Yeah. Again, people, because there is no little or no, I mean, there's little or no atmosphere on the moon, right? If you walk behind a rock into shadow, the temperature very rapidly drops. I mean, within a second, it drops down to minus 150, I think it is, centigrade. You walk out the other side of the rock, and immediately the temperature goes up to 300 or 400 centigrade. And that's why this is the rationale for they spent $12 million on each of the EVA suits, right?
Yeah.
Because the thing in theory, had to be able to cope. So it had refrigeration circuits and also heating circuits. But I've also, how did they manage to build circuitry into the thing, systems into it that could change, that could cope with that extreme range of temperatures? And as the guy from Hasselblad said, that temperature range would just mess up the camera completely and the film. It's as I said before, the devil's in the detail. And I get asked to do these talks. I was just about to say, I got asked to do a talk by a very well-known, international society, mostly made up of men, but a few ladies go along as well.
Yeah.
It's a big audience, several hundred. And I started off, as I always do, by saying, I want you to know that I've met many of these Apollo astronauts, and I found some of them utterly charming, and I corresponded with them and met them many times. I've eaten with them, got drunk with them, I've had dinner with them, and so on. They're very brave, very patriotic, and by and large, are really charming men. But that's not what we're talking about here today. We're talking about what evidence is there that anybody's actually been to the moon. And people were jumping up out of the seat. I'm not going to stand here and listen to this nonsense. I said, look, before you carry on, sir, have you ever met anybody who claims to have been to the moon? I don't need to. Why don't you? How? What do you know about the moon landings? Who is the main contractor on the Saturn V rocket? Okay, what's the top stage of the rocket called? How many motors were there in the main stage? Who was the contractor on the lunar module? Um, what do you actually know about the program at all? Well, the answer is most people know nothing about it, only what
No.
they've been told. That 12 men went to the moon. It was heroic. I mean, you have to ask yourself, why did immediately after Apollo 17, within months, why did they lose all the video uh, recordings, which they did? They're not available, they've gone. Why did they destroy all the jigs, all the hardware, all the plans for the Apollo mission? They've all been destroyed. It's crazy.
Why?
Why would you do that?
Yeah. Why would they
Um,
do that?
yeah. And, about the photographs, I was chatting to this bloke from Hasselblad, and he said, these days, everything, of course, is digital. He said, and, he knew that I ran a website, said, or several websites, and so on and so forth. And he said, you look at the image handling software that you've got on your computer. You've got Paint Shop Pro, you've got Photoshop, and all that. Earth and View. He said you can mess around with, and of course now we've got all kinds of uh, image handling abilities. You've only got to look. You picture of dancing dogs on the telly, all that sort of stuff. On the AI has made anything possible, hasn't it?
Yeah.
But back in those days, they didn't. I bought my first computer in 1997, I think it was. It was a big old thing. It was so, although it was top of the range at the time, you could only have Microsoft Word on it or Microsoft Publisher. If you wanted to put something else on, you had to download or take one of those off. And image handling, you just couldn't do it. And he said he was convinced that NASA got away with it because they could mess about with the photography, and because people didn't have decent software or computers, they had no IT equipment. They got away with it. I've got some incredible photographs that I managed to get from whistleblowers or other enthusiasts, or from the NASA website back in the old days. Of course, the thing is, you wanted to download those in the old days of dial-up. That took such a long time. What's this? No, anyway, an immense amount of time to download this whole catalogue. But now, with the software I've got, you can go through the entire catalogue and you can find something astonishing. There's one photograph I've got of Edgar Mitchell on the moon, and there are two versions of it. One that was the original version with him brightly lit on the side facing the camera, which is nonsense because you can see that the position of the sun is the other side. So it couldn't possibly be lit on both sides unless there was a second source of light on the moon, which
Of
there wasn't.
course.
That photo was altered, and the next version, which is identical except in the lighting, He's actually in dark with a thick black shadow coming towards the camera. So they've changed it to make it credible. I went through. I found hundreds. There's another one I've got which shows two Apollo lunar modules on the surface of the moon at the same time.
Ah,
With the image enhancement we've got now, it's beyond belief how much you go through, how many photographs of the moon have been fiddled about with. They really have. Um, what's Rick trying to what point is Rick making there?
Newton's third law of object requires an opposing force for an opposing reaction. No transparency of energy if nothing to push off.
Well, I mean, bear in mind that the ascent stage on the of the Apollo spacecraft, um, there, I think there's two, maybe there's only two videos allegedly taken from the moon's surface by remote camera, um, by of to the lunar ascent stages, leaving the surface and going up into orbit to orbit with to connect with the command module. Now, um, rockets, that's the whole point about using reaction motors. Rockets don't need anything to push against. They don't need any land or anything. Rockets work in a vacuum. They work in complete dead space. There's the only thing I'd say about all the hardware and everything about that is I'm not alone in thinking it just seems unlikely. I mean, a few years ago, I remember Linda was very proud, my missus. She bought me this birthday card and it had Michael Caine on the front. And when you open it up, it's got built inside it a little microprocessor, a little chip, what's called an EEPROM, okay, erasable programmable read-only memory, right? And it says, "Hello, my name is Michael Caine, and I insist you have a good birthday." There was more memory on that EEPROM chip than on the ascent stage flight computer. Your washing machine is, programmable washing machine. It's got more memory than the whole Apollo spacecraft.
I can imagine so.
And you look at it and think, well, how could they send 12 men down to the lunar surface and bring them back safely 50 odd years ago? The last mission was in 1972, but they haven't been able to do it since. And they're not, they've done one in theory. They've had this last mission to the moon that, orbited the moon and came back again.
That's right.
It's taken them, since 1972 to achieve that. And they're still using reaction motors. They're still using exactly the same sort of technology. It hasn't really changed. There's nothing that special about the latest. And yet they scrapped all the Apollo spacecraft. They scrapped all the Saturn missiles. It just doesn't make any sense at all. I just don't think that. I just find it very hard to believe that they had the technologies to achieve that in 1969. And if they did, I mean, another thing, when I spoke to Gene Cernan once about, where's it going from here? And he was really quite bitter because he said, we were supposed to be going to Mars within 3 years. That's not even the slightest. Well, that was when I spoke to him, that would have been in about 2000 and 2004, 2005, something like that. And he was still bitter about the whole thing then. I
I
mean,
bet he was.
yeah, he was. I mean, stop me rambling. If there's anything you want to sort of,
No, no. We're on about the Apollo 17 returned to Earth in December 1972, and no human has returned to the lunar surface since. Why do you think the Apollo missions abruptly came to an end?
can I just quickly answer the question that's come up on the screen as well? Yeah, is
Yes,
that?
yeah, that's it.
Yeah,
How do you know the moon has no core?
um, it's straightforward sort of science, really. The size of the moon, and from its gravitation effects on the Earth, you can work out its density, you know, and its mass, and its density is far less than it would be if it had a nickel iron core like the other rocky planets. And the received wisdom in astronomy, and my sort of qualifications are in planetary astronomy. The received wisdom is that 4.5 billion years ago, the Earth and another proto planet collided, and the Earth um, received the moon's core, and the debris from the moon spun off into space and eventually coalesced to form the moon in its orbit where it is now. But it's got no it's lost its nickel iron core to the Earth, which is also the reason why the Earth has got a much larger nickel iron core than any of the other rocky planets. Which is the reason why there's life on Earth, because without that magnetic field, we wouldn't be so protected as we are from cosmic radiation. So it's all very, but it's basic sort of science and physics. That is a good question, though. And the answer to your question, why did we not go back? Now, there's two possibilities. One, because we didn't go there in the first place.
Correct.
But the second thing is, I started getting some kind of cryptic remarks and cryptic comments. Do you know what? With the exception of Alan Bean and Jim McDivitt and Jim Lovell, um, and Buzz Aldrin, who have publicly stated that they did see, stated publicly that they saw UFOs or anomalous objects of some sort, uncorrelated objects. But all the others I spoke to all had stories to tell you about UFOs, and some were quite astonishing. I don't believe this thing about, um, you know, there's this famous quote with allegedly of Armstrong, talking to Capcom and saying they're all lined up. The actual quote is along the lines: "They're all lined up on the edge of the crater, sir." Yeah, but there's two things that's stupid about that. They weren't on a crater or anywhere near one, and
No.
two, Neil Armstrong wouldn't have called Capcom sir. Again, it's based on ignorance. Whoever came up with that story just doesn't know how the Apollo missions or all space missions work. Capsule communicator, Capcom, is always an astronaut. And in the case of the moon landings, it was Charlie Duke. He was Capcom at the time of the landings, of the Apollo 11 landing when it landed.
Right.
He's like, "Got a bunch of us just about breathing here." That's him. And Neil Armstrong certainly wouldn't have called Charlie Duke sir,
No.
not in a million billion years. So that's one. But I'd always had this kind of idea that they expected on the Apollo missions that they were going to find they weren't the first people there or the first intelligences on the moon. Now, I mean, the other thing is, as you know, I've always been interested. My earliest heroes in spaceflight, if you like, were going back to the days of. I mean, I wasn't around in 1948 when Chuck Yeager broke the sound barrier, but I was aware of everything that was going on with the X-plane programs out in the deserts in Nevada. If you ever see the film The Right Stuff, it kind of makes a good comparison.
It does, yeah.
Oh, it's a wonderful film between the superb pilots, the X program, like Scott Crossfield and and among those pilots flying the X-15, believe it or not, was Neil Armstrong. He flew and so much so that some of the X-15 pilots actually got astronauts' wings because they. I think it's 50 miles above the Earth's surface you have to achieve to be classified as an astronaut, and half a dozen managed that. Some paved their life. I think Ed White, I think he got killed, but most of them reported some kind of, and Scott Crossfield was on record saying, we expected to see other intelligence or encounter other intelligences in space before we went to the moon. We expected to, and we were very excited about the idea. And of course, this all, I suppose, the modern era of USOs all kicked off in 1948, didn't it, with Roswell and one thing and another, 47. And you think, well, the more pilots I spoke to, the more astronauts I spoke to, the more I came to the conclusion that they were all told to expect encounters of some form, and that in our Forbidden Moon, my book, I've put forward the hypothesis that, in a sense, the Apollo mission stopped because we were warned off. Simply that,
Yeah.
there's some kind of dialogue has been going on. It's often said, isn't it, that this dialogue with alien intellects began with Eisenhower in the 40s, 50s. I'll put it forward as a possibility that whatever this dialogue is, it includes an embargo on too much exploration of the moon. And people say, oh, yeah, but you think about it. If the space shuttle, which I think was an incredible piece of equipment, wonderful, one of the greatest technological achievements. But if you had a globe of the Earth a foot across, all right, 30 centimeters across, the
Yeah.
space shuttle, yeah, well, the space shuttle was literally about 2 to 3 millimeters above the surface. It only ever flew to 250, miles above the Earth. Bear in mind, the moon is 240,000 miles away. There's a whole world of difference between it. It almost looks like from 1972, if the moon landings did occur, from 1972 onwards, we just, in a sense, abandoned the possibility of leaving near Earth space. We've never done it. And other people say there's another possibility is the famous, which I'm sure a lot of people know, there's the famous Van Allen radiation belts.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, and some of the recent draft of astronauts have been, without thinking what they're saying, without looking back and sort of correlating with what's been said earlier by earlier groups of astronauts, have said things. Oh yeah, a major problem we've got to solve is getting through the Van Allen radiation belt. Well, I think people have got this idea that the Apollo spacecraft, or all the but the Gemini, Mercury, Soyuz, Salyut, all those, they never got anywhere near the Van Allen belt. Only Apollo went through it. You know, and some of the things people say is on the same lines as the guy when he said to Buzz Aldrin, you know, why don't once you've been to the moon, why don't you go to the sun? This is a quote from Buzz Aldrin. It's
Ah,
quite funny, and he said, "The surface of the sun is 6,000 centigrade. It's 1,000,000 degrees in the atmosphere of the sun. Corona." He said, "Well," the guy said, "Well, why don't you go at night then?" Well, that's the kind of response you get when you talk about going through the Van Allen radiation belt. I mean, if you need an incredible amount of shielding. I'm prepared uh, to be educated on this subject, but I've spoken to some very serious scientists. And they've said they can't understand how it was possible to travel, even if you're only going through it for a few minutes. I forget what the actual figure is. I'm getting old.
yeah.
All this research is years ago. But I know I suppose it's a quarter of an hour, half an hour or something to get through the Van Allen belt. That's like saying that's all right to walk about on the surface of a nuclear core of a reactor as long as it's only for 15 minutes. It doesn't make any sense. Um, and again, when they're on the moon, uh, how they, how they, again, I wonder how many people know this. The Apollo spacecraft, the lunar module, it's so thin, the outside of it, that when they were building them, remember I used to sell space flown hardware, and
Yes.
one of the most popular things, I had these tiles. They're like rubber Marley tiles, but they were put inside the floor of the lunar module while the technicians on Earth are working on it. For the simple reason that in the early days, people were dropping spanners or screwdrivers before these things were installed, and they would go straight through the floor because it's literally only the thickness of 2 layers of cooking foil, the whole thing. Now, you know, okay, how is that supposed to protect them from the
Yeah.
cosmic radiation that bathes the moon all the time? We've had all these fantastic displays of the aurora last year, haven't we? Or
Yes.
last 12 months, and they're all caused by solar radiation. Now, that solar radiation, the so-called, those particles, high energy particles flung out by the sun when there's a prominence or any kind of out, coronal mass ejection, any of those things, if you happen to be on the moon and it's swept across the moon, you'd literally be microwaved.
Gosh, good. Yeah.
So there's so much about the whole thing, that makes you wonder why did we not go back? Why are they? What's the situation now? Well, we'll find out, won't we, in a couple of years? If I'm wrong, we'll find out if actually they do go to the moon and manage to walk about. So I don't buy these photographs, that the from the Indian. Can't think of the name of it now, but from the Indians.
Oh, yes, the Indian one.
Yeah. Um, they, that's done more than anything to convince people of the reality of the Apollo program. But among the people was I met several Blackbird SR-71 pilots, and they were absolutely scornful of those images. I'll tell you why, because the Blackbird used to fly between 5, 7 miles above the Earth, right? And photographing through the sort of, as a wildlife photographer, I'll tell you that your enemy is the heat haze in the atmosphere and smoke haze and clouds, ice crystals. If I like most bird photographers, I've got these long lenses, okay, that I use, telephoto lenses or prime lenses,
Yeah.
but they're just to get you better detail of a. You don't want to be trying to photograph a bird more than 60 or 70 meters away because of during the daytime the heat haze, it just makes the whole thing shimmy and out of focus, right? So these are SR-71 Blackbird pilots. They said, even through all that, the cameras by the time we were flying, which is just after Apollo, I mean, I think the Blackbird flew about the same time as Apollo, we could photograph a packet of cigarettes held in the hand of a Russian officer and read what his preference for cigarettes was. We could photograph the number plates of the cars in car parks at various military establishments. We could do that from 5 miles through cloud, through haze, through moisture. He said, now this Indian space probe was supposed to go 50 to 60 miles above them. They should be able to photograph the individual treads on the footprints.
Of course, they should be able
He
to.
said, and given the technology, the photo enhancement technology that exists now, you wouldn't just get these little smudgy little blobs that are supposed to be the lunar module and little windy lines. That's they can they have photographed using the American orbital lunar orbiter space LEO, the lunar orbiter spacecraft. They managed to photograph from that same sort of height, rocks 10 centimeters across. So the whole thing just doesn't tie up. But there we are. People will believe what they want to believe, don't they?
Of course they will, yeah.
Yeah,
I know
as long as
Les is on about here. Um, Les reckons the moon is hollow as a satellite hit the moon and echoed for hours.
it did. They've done it since, but it became the habit to. Once they took off from the moon in the ascent stage, the Apollo ascent stage, they this is the tricky bit. They would then uh, meet up with the command and service modules, which were still in orbit. I was still sorry for the command module pilot because he had to sit up there all by himself in the case of Apollo 17 or 72 hours or something and go round and round the moon with no communications for half the time. Anyway, so they'd meet up and the crew would go across into the command module, and then they would fire the ascent stage back against the moon. And they left on the moon. This is a theory. They left on the moon seismographs to record and transmit the data. That's when they found this, made this strange discovery that the moon, as your correspondent there said, actually kind of rang like a bell. I mean, the Earth rings like a bell when there's an earthquake or a meteoric impact or something. But
Yeah.
it went on ringing for a lot longer than people thought it would from such a small impact. And of course, that's what they just recently did with the one of Mr. Musk's rockets was fired into the moon, wasn't it? That did the same thing. But I mean, it's possible that there are cavities within the moon, left over from this initial, coalition stage after the initial impact that formed it. But that's what the truth of the matter is. Several times they sent lunar modules down to crash onto the moon. I mean, there's a lot about the moon. It is really peculiar. There's a fantastic book. I'm lucky enough to. I've got quite a large library because I've been doing it so long. I've been able to buy these things when they're
I
still.
bet you have.
Yeah, incredible. Yeah. And there's but somebody else is on the moon is an amazing book. This guy went through every photograph. Here's an astonishing thing. Back in the 50s, yeah, the two leading British amateur astronomers, Harold Wilkins and Patrick Moore, um, announced in various articles that an artificial bridge had been discovered on the moon across the bay of the Mare Crisium. If you look at the moon when it's full, the top right hand corner, you can see a dark circular feature, which is the Sea of
Right.
Crisis, the Murray
Yeah.
and Wilkins and Moore actually published drawings they'd made of it, and it was an American astronomer, I think, who discovered it, and but Wilkins even wrote about it in a book, and they were convinced it was an artificial structure. And it led to a lot of excitement, the idea that the moon, while it may not be occupied now, it may have been in the past, which again is a distinct possibility, I would have thought. Um, I remember talking to, name drop, remember talking to Patrick Moore about that, and he was, very, I didn't know, blah, blah, blah. In other words, he was embarrassed to admit that
I bet he was.
he also once wrote a book called The Man from Mars, in which he wrote it under a nom de plume, in which he claimed that he'd met a Martian and spent time talking to him. And I asked him about this, and he said, well, that wasn't me. That's some." I said, "But it's got a photograph of your observatory and your telescope on the back cover." Oh, well,
Yeah.
I don't want to say that. I don't want to say that. And so, in other words, what's happened is that on a completely parallel, but do you know the phrase conspiracy theory was invented by the CIA to discredit? They applied it to anybody who had their own individual thoughts about how Kennedy was killed, right? Which we're
That's
not talking
right.
about today. They said, there's this conspiracy theory about another gunman on the grassy knoll. So they invented the words conspiracy theory entirely to discredit original thought or any contradiction to the mainstream. And that is used again and again and again these days. I mean, so much so I wrote a book which I call the Conspiracy, showing how anybody who's got any independent thought has come up with different, like we're talking about the moon landings, like we could be talking
Yeah.
about UFOs. Anybody who's got an interest in those things and is called a conspiracy theorist, not a seeker after truth or astronautical historian. And that's a classic case we're talking about now. Anybody, this because of your own interests, and we were talking before about other people we know, uh, Paul and John, the UFO guy.
And Hanson.
Yeah, John Hanson, and I mean the famous one. Oh God, I've forgotten his name. He's a concert violinist. He's written some really interesting books.
Oh, God, yeah.
I think his name. He's a very urbane, suave guy. I think he's like a lot of these people. He's lost interest in the thing because he's got fed up with people taking a mickey or being ridiculed or being dismissed as a conspiracist. If I can just say at this point, I mean, I'm famous for actually saying this sometimes in the wrong places, but I've done so many talks. I've done several talks. I've chaired and emceed meetings at Woodbridge, about the Rendlesham thing.
Oh, yeah, Woodridge, yeah, Rendlesham,
And
yeah.
I've got to know at the time, I'm recently, but I got to know Charles Holt quite well,
Holmes, yeah. I
and
met him.
yeah, and Nick Pope and all the others, and all the others, like even the notorious Larry Warren. I've met them all. Um,
I have too.
yeah, yeah. You get lung cancer just being in the same room with Larry, don't you? Anyway,
Oh, you do.
it's a smoker. Anyway, the point about it is when you do those talks and things, you're running the risk of losing any potential professional credibility you might have. And I'm sure that's why a lot of these people have done it, because, you know, and the thing is, I made this point at one of the talks I gave there. I said, there are three types of people interested in the UFO phenomenon. And he'll buck that really, three, why? I said, there are people who, if I could put myself in this category first and foremost, who at some point in their lives have had an encounter of some form with an aerial object they can't explain, and they want to know what it was. They're looking for some kind of explanation. They're looking for closure. They're looking for support from people who had similar things. I mean, I told you I saw my first proper UFO when I was 5,
Hmm.
6, and I've seen right the way through to when I was a pilot in the Navy, and since then, and while I've been involved in astronomy, I mean, I haven't seen hundreds of them, but I've seen probably a dozen or two, photographed a few. And then The second group of people are people who write books. So I'm in this category as well, unfortunately, who write books and give talks on the subject, but they don't do it necessarily because they've got any particular belief in it, but because it's a good way to make a few quid. It's a bandwagon you can get onto to, to sell tickets to your lectures, to sell your books and stuff. And I think some of the more famous or notorious authors about UFOs, they sometimes change. I mean, I'm not going to possibly say the names because I don't want to get in trouble.
No.
There's a very famous lady who wrote all these books about, how UFOs and UFO landings, and how many, interviewing all the witnesses and stuff. And then when people lost interest in buying any more books and that, she starts writing books about how they're all, they're all astronomical events, or the satellites entering the Earth's atmosphere, or the top secret aircraft. They completely changed their entire thesis to sell a
They
few
do.
more books. And I find that a bit shocking, really. I've always stuck to my guns,
Best
until I,
way, isn't it?
yeah, until like you, or like until you get new evidence. I mean, that's how the scientific principle works. You collect data, you compile it, you collate it, you consider it, you come up with a theory, you then take the theory back and collect more data to see whether it reinforces it or not, and
Yeah,
eventually come up with a hypothesis, uh, and until some new data comes along, you stick with it. That's what I've always done. But the last group, and you won't like me saying this possibly, but I'm sure you'll admit it, there are some absolute crackpots, complete
oh,
Fruit Loops, and you meet them every conference you do. You've got three-quarters of the audience are the truth seekers, just basically people who are interested in it. So,
of
but you've
course,
also
yeah,
got the
yeah.
ones who go, "Oh, I've got a camel in my handbag," and all that sort of crew. They've got UFOs landing in their back garden every 5 minutes.
Hear it
Um,
all the time.
yeah, and
There's a
unfortunately, they're the
question from
ones that tell you, aren't they?
Rick Allen here. David, just to be clear, no nation has ever visited the moon. Why do nations such as the Americans and the Russians just don't call each other out?
You mean why don't the Russians say you never went to the moon? Um, Firstly, people have been to the moon, but not human, but not living people. In other words, the moon has been visited any number of times now by spacecraft or robots. In fact, the Russians were the first to do that properly, to have one roaming Luna 2, I think it was called. Anyway, a very early rover. It was the first thing to bring back moon rocks. So a lot of the data that we know about the moon has come from, robotic probes, and the same with Mars and even Venus in the case of the Russians.
Yeah,
Why don't the Russians call? Well, the Americans aren't going to call anybody out. Or, I mean, because nobody else has attempted to land on the moon allegedly. Another one of the Russian cosmonauts I did get to know quite well was the first man to do a spacewalk, a guy called Alexei Leonov. And I always thought if anybody knew whether or not they'd been to the moon or not, it would be him, because he got quite friendly with them, and he was involved in the Apollo Soyuz joint mission. And he got quite friendly with Alan Bean because of that. Where a Russian Soyuz spacecraft and an American Apollo spacecraft joined up and spent a few days together in orbit.
right.
It looked like everything was going to go really great with sort of meeting in space and cooperation in revisiting the moon. That was the theory. It never happened, of course. And I said to him, why did the Russians never, go to the moon? After all, the Soyuz spacecraft was designed as their lunar lander. And there were two aspects. One was the death of an astronaut called Komarov, who got killed when his Soyuz spacecraft hideously malfunctioned. Everything that could go wrong with it did go wrong with it. And it is said, well, it's more than said, it's known that he died screaming abuse and insults to the Russian politicians and, the presidium all the way down until the spacecraft hit the ground, right? Um, so that was one they had to completely redesign the Soyuz spacecraft, which would have gotten to the moon before Apollo, or before the projected date for Apollo. The second thing is they built this huge moon rocket. Do you know what? It wasn't called Proton. Do you know? Again, I'm getting old. I forgot the name of it. But they launched three of them, and every one of them blew up just after launch. And he said the problem they had This is the key things. They couldn't understand how the Americans got away with it because the problem they had was those during the initial acceleration, the surging fuel slopping backwards and forwards inside the tanks was bursting these things during the initial acceleration. The Russians had a very clever way of doing things, unlike the Saturn V, which had five enormous F1 uh, rocket motors. Okay,
Yeah.
um, if any one of those motors had failed, apart from the center one, if the center one failed, you could still climb into low orbit. If any of the others failed, you'd be dead because you'd have asymmetric thrust and it would push you over. You'd have to rely on the escape tower mechanism, which was extremely dubious to say the least. The Russians had their Proton, I think it was called, their big rocket. It had like their Soyuz launchers do now. They have dozens and dozens of little rockets. As I say, you could lose loads of. You could lose two or three, four, five of them, as long as they weren't all in one place, and the thing would still fly into orbit because they made less contribution to the. So in other words, he was basically saying that we did plan to go to the moon, and we were carefully watching. But he was always dubious about some of the claims, always dubious about how good the American hardware was. He was dubious about how quickly they managed to rebuild Apollo after Apollo 1 fire. And then he said, I suppose when you get down to it, it was all about prestige. The first people on the moon were the ones who got the prestige. We stopped worrying about it after Apollo 11 because we knew we couldn't be the first on the moon. And they never made any effort to go to the moon since. But a cynic might say that the reason they stopped going to the moon was they realised it wasn't going to be possible for whatever reasons, which we were talking about earlier. You know,
Yes.
maybe there was some embargo, but for whatever reason, maybe it was the problems with the Van Allen belt. The Russians just realised it wasn't going to be possible using normal chemical rockets, and the kind of spacecraft. Um, and the reason the Russians didn't call the Americans out, well, they wouldn't necessarily know. I mean, like I said, the Americans and the Russians and the Chinese and the Indians and other races, I think now, have landed robotic probes on the moon. And before the Apollo missions, there was the Surveyor spacecraft, and before there was the Ranger spacecraft that, well, in case of the Surveyor, actually landed. In fact, on Apollo 12, they actually touched down within sight of the Surveyor 3 spacecraft, which had soft landed in the same part of the moon. So you could, a hypothesis, if you wanted to believe they didn't go to the moon, but they managed to con the Russians, would be that the crew went into low Earth orbit, okay, which they had to do anyway before what they called TLI, translunar insertion. At which point the Apollo spacecraft dropped down and landed in the ocean, but the S4B stage or some other, the lunar module, etc., carried on to the moon, okay, and automatically, as they did with Surveyor, apparently completed the mission. Whereas the astronauts were, or maybe the astronauts were. Uh, there's a lot of video around at the moment showing the escape capsules, which the modern raft of of lunar astronauts would use to get away from the spacecraft. You've probably seen them. Well, they had those on Apollo. Maybe they never bolted into the capsule in the first place. Maybe the whole thing was done, robotically. And the Russians will attract it, as people on Earth did. Um, if you ever see the film Capricorn One, there's a guy there, one of the capsule communicators, or getting a download from telemetry, and he can't understand why it's all happening so quickly. But the moon's only a quarter of a million miles away, and the time lag is only a second or two. I mean, the sun is 8 light minutes away. It takes radio or light 8 minutes to get here from the sun, but from the moon, it's only a second. So when you go, Houston, Tranquility Base, the Eagle has landed, 2, 3. We copy you down, Houston. You wouldn't even notice. The whole thing could have been done, robotically, remotely from Earth, and the Russians wouldn't have been any the wiser. Why would they? And people say, "Oh, how could you get away with it? How are the thousands of people?" But look at the Manhattan program. How many tens and tens of thousands of engineers, scientists, technicians were involved in building the H bomb. In during wartime, when people, monitoring people was so difficult, um, they got away with that.
Of
Without
course they
people
did.
suspecting what was going on. There's many examples of that. Again, people come up with these things. They just don't know how the program works. Just one last thought on the subject. If you look at mission control at Houston during the Apollo missions, those desks, 40 over 40 odd desks there, each one of those people has got a speciality that they're. You've got the flight surgeon. You've got the EECOM. You've got the ballistics and all that sort of thing. Each one has got his own set of downloads. Each astronaut has got a surgeon looking at his telemetry. Okay, they don't look
Yeah.
at anything else. They're not interested in anything else. And so therefore they don't have an overview, and they wouldn't know. And again, it's this 1 second delay, and or 2 seconds. They wouldn't know. So, uh, how many people would have to know if the whole thing had been faked? How many people would have to? Not many. The
Not
astronauts
many would know, would they?
the astronauts themselves, not even the lock-in crew, but the ones who put the astronauts, maybe the people who make the decisions. You could probably get away with it with, I suppose, the senior flight controller like Gene Kranz. You could probably get away. Less than 100 people would have to know. I mean, even if they drop the capsules out the back of a C-130 or something on parachutes, the recovery crew wouldn't know any different, would they?
No,
They've been told. We tend to believe what we've been told to expect.
that is it.
Yeah,
What we've been told.
yeah, and that's the same with everything we might want to talk about. Now or any time in the future, like ghosts, UFOs, the orb phenomenon. People are filled with preconceptions and uh, and misconceptions too, based on what they've been told. You know, Well,
True.
yeah, I'm sure you're the same. When I was a little kid, I was extremely lucky. I had an uncle who would have been called these days a hippie. He wasn't. He was a free thinker. He was very interested in Edgar Casey and Charles Fort and all that. And he got me interested in all that when I was quite young, five or
Yeah.
six. And he showed me. Now you're going to laugh. He showed me how to see orbs, auras. Okay, and I don't make a habit of doing it now, but I was really good at doing it at one time. And he showed me several sort of mechanisms, some exercises you could do. And as soon as you become accepted of it, you get to see them. Back in the hippie days, without any chemical substances, I might add, you
Yeah.
know, we routinely used to examine people's auras, and those of animals and plants and stuff. I actually, you must have heard of Curlian photographs. Actually, can photograph auras of living tissue. Anyway, but I realised that what the rest of the adults in my life were trying to do was beat all this out of me all the time. You're not allowed to believe in this. You're not allowed to believe in that. Ghosts are no such thing. UFOs, no such thing. It's nonsense. And I think that's basically what society is subject to. We're brainwashed all the time. We're drugged with TV and football. Somebody made a good point. Remember when football, for people of our age, used to be you you go down the football with your mates. I used to go to West Ham, I'm afraid to say.
Oh God, yeah.
You pay your two bob to get into the bowling ground. They pass you down the front, pass you over the fence, and you sit on the little wall. You sit down in the grass and watch the game. No swearing, no bottles of urine being thrown all over the place, and 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 then you'd watch Jimmy Greaves come out on the pitch, put out his fag, and run out onto the pitch.
Jimmy Greaves, yeah. I remember
Well,
Jimmy. Of
yeah, that was what it was. It was the man in the street sport, wasn't it?
course he was.
Now look at it. It's run and owned by billionaires. The footballers are multi-millionaires, and the season ticket even for sort of a fairly non-achieving club like Norwich, the season ticket. You can have payment plans because it's so expensive. It's just
Horrendous now, isn't it?
and that's how
Just,
people have
just
come to
before,
accept.
just before we go,
Yeah.
Rick wanted to ask a question here. I've asked this a few times to people. David, do you think we are chosen to see those UFOs?
Oh, you mean guys like you, me, and Paul and whatnot?
Yeah,
I'll tell you something. I've often asked myself the same question. Now, the problem I've got is I wear two hats. On the one hand, I mean, I'm retired now, but I was a working meteorologist. Okay, and I write books and lectures and magazine articles and do radio. So I've got to be a serious scientist with my serious scientist hat on. But on the
Yeah.
other hand, I'm afraid I have to confess I believe in the existence of all kinds of things that mark me out as a lunatic. For example, I believe in the existence of, as a cryptozoologist, I believe in the existence of Bigfoot. I've
Hmm.
always believed it. And I think people who don't believe in it are just shutting their eyes to the eyewitness evidence. I believe in the Loch response. The sad part is I've actually seen it. I don't believe it. It can't really exist. All the biology is against it. But years ago, in 1972, I think I actually saw it. I've written a book about it. That puts me in the category of people who make it. I've never made any money out of my books. They sell a few thousand. Um, so you've got this dichotomy, and I suddenly realised that I've seen ghosts, I've seen UFOs, I see orbs, I can see them with the naked eye sometimes. I was in Rendlesham Forest with some mates who didn't really believe in them, and a green orb about 30 centimetres across just drifted across the path in front of us. They nearly cacked themselves. The last thing they believed in. One of them has gone on to see, which is, I think, significant. He's gone on to see several UFOs. He's a keen amateur astronomer, and he's more and more. And another one had an incredible experience with a UFO um, uh, just above the White Cliffs of a place called Berlin Gap, just above the White Cliffs of Dover. He didn't believe in them, but he has to now because he had those chilling. I won't bore you with it now, but he had the most chilling experience that he's left him with physical impairments.
Oh my God.
So I think what happens is that we have it all thrashed out of us when we're kids, but some of us carry on like you, like me, and others with this naive open-mindedness, and you just see things. Um, and answered your question as a question. Yes, I think we're chosen to see them in the sense that we're open-minded. It's as easy as that. Um, I also wonder if perhaps we've got a slightly different level of consciousness. I don't know, but
Yes.
I know some people see things and other people don't.
Correct.
And I've been with people, and half the group have seen something amazing, the other half have seen nothing. But then, I've been out bird watching, and something really special is flying about, and there are always going to be individuals who just cannot, for some reason or other,
See
cannot.
you.
Yeah, so I think that's it's a good question. And I think my own, if you want my own, somewhat, what's the elitist answer? I do think that because I've maintained that childlike openness and acceptance, and I don't dismiss anything just on because I've been told that I have to dismiss it. I rather make my own mind up, and because I spend most of my life looking up anyway, and in the dark, so not. One thing I will say is quite funny. I used to see ghosts all the time, or spirit entities, whatever you want to call them.
Yeah.
But the older I get, the less I see. It's not. I've got perfect eyesight, but I just think somehow some part of your brain gradually shuts down. I used to see a lot more when I was a kid, and I had a younger daughter. She used to see things all the time. And don't you think little kids have imaginary playmates, don't they?
They
How do,
do. Yeah.
how do adults know they're imaginary? You
Yeah.
know. Anyway, it's been a great evening. I've enjoyed chatting. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you very much indeed. It's been good. Everybody's in the chat room has had questions for you tonight as well. What you got planned for the future?
When what? Sorry.
What you got planned for the future for yourself?
I'm 75. I haven't got much of a future ahead, have I? No, I mean, I'm always open minded. I mean, I suddenly get the urge to write another book. I've got 8 books in print. Um, there's room for number nine, I
Where
think.
can people get your books?
Um, well, I've actually got a website where you can sell them. But they're all on Amazon, and you can get them from me. The website is just david-bryant.com. But my Birds of the Heath. If you type Birds of the Heath into Google, my main blog website comes up. There's links to everything. There's links to lots of photographs of stuff we've been talking about tonight, like
Oh, good.
me with the Apollo astronauts. In case people think I've been making it all up.
Oh,
Um,
no.
so yeah, um, I, I'm like you. Age isn't a barrier to the quest for knowledge, is it? And in
No.
fact, so much so, every couple of times every year, I go and this sounds it's a bit like Malcolm Robinson. This, some friends and we go down to Rendlesham. We do an all night vigil in the forest.
Why not?
Yeah,
Why not?
you wouldn't believe some of the things we've seen.
I
That.
know.
Yeah.
I used to know Derek Savory,
Sorry.
who I used to know Derek Savory, who
Oh,
passed.
yeah. Well, it's a very mysterious place, regardless of the 1980 UFO landing, which I'm convinced was a genuine experience. If you spent any time with Charles Hall,
Oh,
you
yeah,
know it happened. Um, but
it did.
it's a strange place. I'm not sure there are Bigfoot walking about in the woods there. Like,
I know. I haven't been down before Derek died. He kept saying, why are you and Paul coming down to see me?" I
mm,
said, "We will do one day." Unfortunately, Derek's passed,
yeah,
but I'd love to go down with Philip and Ronnie Kingsella.
yeah. Ronnie's a good guy. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
and there's. I think Brenda. I think is still kicking around, isn't
Brenda
she?
Butler.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah,
she'll never lose her enthusiasm for it. I don't think.
no, she won't. No, no,
Yeah.
no. She's had some sightings and some strange visitors as well.
She has. She has indeed. Yeah. Do you know? We've been talking for over an hour and a quarter.
I know, I know. Anyway, yeah. So thank you for coming on the show. It's been absolutely amazing.
You're most
Next time we get on, we'll talk about ghosts and other different things.
well. It's a pleasure to talk to you. It really was, and I'm sorry if I've been a bit uh,
No, no,
monopolised.
everybody's enjoying it.
Okay. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks for all your audience for listening. Most grateful.
Oh, thank you. Never mind. My guest on Friday, if I remember it rightly, oh, it's supposed to be on the other weekend. Anyway, couldn't make it. Uh, where are we? It's David Darcy Weir.
All right. Okay.
He's a really good guest. He is on Friday. He's into all different sorts of things, believe it or not. Um, but he'll be a good guest on Friday. That's at 7 p.m.
I'll have a
in the
listen.
UK this
Yeah.
Friday coming.
Excellent.
Yeah, so thank you again. Thank you to everybody in the chat room. Everybody have a good evening. If you're going out somewhere or doing things like now, probably I won't be going out tonight. But
Oh, I won't. It's
I'll
raining
speak,
here.
yeah, I'll speak to you in a minute.